Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
My next guest, former Chancellor of the Exchequer and former leader of the Vote Leave campaign, Nigel Lawson. Welcome to the Daily Politics. You've said in the past that the UK has nothing to fear from a no deal going forward. Why not?
Well, why should we? It's not the ideal best solution, but it's a perfectly acceptable solution. We already do far more trade with the rest of the world than we do with the rest of the European Union. And the great bulk of that trade is on WTO terms, and it's perfectly acceptable. Mrs. May said right at the beginning, quite rightly, in the Lancaster House speech, I think, that no deal, we're talking about trade deal, not about the deals over citizenship, not European Union citizens here and British citizens like me living on the continent. We're not talking about intelligence sharing. This is simply about trade. And as I say, the bulk of our trade is not with the European Union, and the non-European Union bit is growing much faster. I don't know whether you ever go shopping. You're too busy, actually.
I think you'll find I do.
But you will see goods from all over the world here.
Right. Why do you think it would be a disaster if there was no deal or, as James McGrory said in that clip, we were to crash out on a cliff edge?
Well, I think, first of all, that it's important to get the figures right. It's not quite true that we trade more with the rest of the world than with the European Union. It was actually Sky, I think, very recently that displayed very well those figures, which is that whenever you are mentioning those figures, you are taking into account gold. And gold, which is a very substantial amount of those figures, simply transits through the UK, and it's not really part of the trade of the UK.
Here is the finished article. These are London Good Delivery gold bars. They are small but surprisingly heavy, and between the two of them they're worth the best part of £1 million, and that's really the nub of this story. A few of these are enough to distort Britain's trade figures.
From London, those bars are then flown to China, to India, to Switzerland, all non-EU countries. That makes it look as if Britain is actually doing more trade outside Europe. Sky News analysis reveals the scale of that distortion. The official trade figures show that in the past 5 years, only 46% of Britain's goods exports went to the EU. But strip out gold and it's a different story. Britain actually exported fully half of its physical goods to Europe. In other words, perhaps we're not quite the great trading nation we might think we are. Food for thought as we consider the post-Brexit world. Much of London's gold is to be found here, in the vaults underneath the Bank of England. But in reality, Britain doesn't produce these bars or even own them. They come from the other side of the world. Back where we began. The great irony is that most of the gold coming out of the ground here will end its life under the ground somewhere else. But as long as it comes via London, it'll continue to confuse the picture of how much trade we do with the rest of the world.
In any case, I think that when you are coming to the WTO, and the effect that it would have to rely on the WTO only, it is very easy to look only at the tariffs. But tariffs is something of the past in trade. It was when Nigel was in government that this really was about the tariffs in trade and the creation of the WTO. That moved to services, and now the whole game of trade is on regulation. And there is nothing in the WTO about regulation. I was a negotiator there with it, bits and pieces, really minimal. That is why it was the UK, Margaret Thatcher at the time, came up with the internal market concept, which is about regulation.
Right, well,
rules.
on regulation,
and it didn't happen. And it didn't happen. It was an aspiration.
Right, but on non-tariff barriers, do you accept that that is the big worry for businesses? It is non-tariff barriers.
No, services are particularly important for us, obviously. As Mrs. Clegg says, services are particularly important because they're a large part of our economy. And what Margaret Thatcher, and I was alongside her at the time, what Margaret Thatcher was concerned about was that there were, although there were no tariffs in trade with the European Union, with our friends and partners in the European Union, there were a whole lot of different regulations, and there still are. The promise was the single market would bring regulatory uniformity. It hasn't. But anyhow, as I say, we trade with all over, and the rest of the world trades with the European Union. United States trades with the European Union. China trades with the European Union. The really important thing now is that we prepare for the no-deal outcome, and it is grossly irresponsible if we don't prepare.
Right. Is Philip Hammond being grossly irresponsible in not preparing now in the way that you would like him to do?
I fear he is, yes.
Why? He says he's not going to waste money at this point. He's
Look,
the Chancellor. You know what it's like when you're in charge of the money.
Yeah, but you have to spend money from time to time, and there is nothing more important than preparing for what has always been the most likely outcome. I've been on the record since throughout the Brexit process as saying realistically, the most likely outcome is no trade deal. And there is nothing more important than preparing for what has always been the most likely outcome. I've been on the record since throughout the Brexit process as saying realistically, the most likely outcome is no trade deal. They do not want to give us a good trade deal nor an acceptable trade deal, not because they dislike us, nothing to do with that, but they are terrified that if they give us a good deal, the pressure in some other countries to leave the European Union will grow.
Is he undermining these negotiations, Philip Hammond, and undermining the government?
That may not be his intention, but I fear that he is.
So what should Theresa May do?
Well, I think probably a reshuffle.
And where should he be reshuffled to?
That's for her to decide.
Right, but he shouldn't be Chancellor any longer because
I fear not.
You think he's holding up these negotiations?
Yeah, I fear that he is unhelpful. Yeah, I fear that what he is doing, he may not intend it, but in practice, what he is doing is very close to sabotage.
Don't you think that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Bernard Jenkin, as we heard from Anna Soubry there, are the ones that are actually destabilising the negotiations with name-calling of treachery, bordering on the dishonest?
Anna Soubry is a fanatic on this issue, a complete fanatic. That's why you had her on the programme. I know that.
Is she a fanatic? Is Anna Soubry a fanatic? Is representing that view
I don't
fanatical?
know Anna Soubry at all, but what I do know is that it is impossible for this country to handle one of the most difficult political times ever, almost a complete reinvention of all the regulation, all the economic model, with all this deep division in the party that is in government. It simply cannot happen, and either the Prime Minister manages to unite the cabinet by changing the cabinet or doing whatever it is, or else you are going to need another Prime Minister.
Right. Well, Miriam Gonzalez has also said that there needs to be a change in the cabinet in order to bring unity. If Philip Hammond were to be reshuffled
we agree on
out,
something then.
Yeah, you do agree on something. Hurrah! If he were to be reshuffled out, Philip Hammond, who would you like to see as Chancellor who would be able to get a good deal?
I am not going to answer your question for the obvious reason that A, it is Mrs. May's choice, not mine, and B, that if I did say, I don't think it would be particularly helpful.
Well, except you've said that Philip Hammond, you think, should be moved, so would Michael Gove be a good Chancellor?
I'm sure that he is one of those who would be.
Any others?
No, I'm not going to go into this.
On Philip Hammond saying that actually the worst case scenario of no deal, a disorderly exit, would be planes being grounded and lorries stacked up through Kent. Is that a realistic scenario?
It's not realistic, with the exception of this, that if there are no contingency arrangements made, no preparations made, no money spent on preparations, then there might be difficulties of this kind, and that is why it is so irresponsible not to be making those contingency arrangements.
Right. How important would it be, in your mind, Miri, if there were preparations, if there was a lot of money spent on the no-deal scenario, couldn't it work if businesses had time to prepare, that you wouldn't end up with planes being grounded or lorries stacked up through Kent?
Listen, I work as a lawyer in this area, and therefore I don't really look at it so much with the political perspective, emotional and interesting as it is, but from the point of view of what business tell us. And if you ask, for example, any airline, they are all deeply concerned that trying to replace the common aviation area, which is what they deal with, is easy, it provides access in both directions. It is a really difficult thing. I cannot answer whether hypothetically, if over many years there was a really competent government and tried to change completely the country, whether that would be possible with a lot of money as well thrown into it or not. But it doesn't seem to me that what I'm seeing right now from the government goes any near that direction.
Right, and if you look at the ongoing trade dispute, Nigel Lawson, between the Canadian firm Bombardier and its rival Boeing, that hardly will inspire people with confidence about this great panacea of future trade deals outside the EU.
Look, there's always problems in life, for goodness sake. But coming back to what businessmen want, what businessmen want is to know where they stand as soon as possible. A prolonged period of uncertainty is the worst possible thing for business. And what worries me is allowing this thing to drag on and on and on. Businessmen want to know where they stand, and then they can handle it, provided, as I say, the government's made the proper preparations, and that is perfectly practicable. And you talk about airlines. Airlines fly all over the world. I mean, airlines don't fly only to the European, our friends on the European continent.
No, of course, but people would be worried if they thought they were going to be grounded even for a
short
short period of time.
Yeah, well, they're not going to be if people are sensible and, as I say, people make adequate preparations.
Nigel Lawson, thank you.
Thank you.
First of all today, the Chancellor Philip Hammond is in Washington for a meeting of the International Monetary Fund. Perhaps he'll find a friendlier audience there than he has of late among some of his own party here. Yesterday, Nigel Lawson, former Conservative Chancellor and senior figure in the Vote Leave campaign, told me he feared Mr Hammond was being grossly irresponsible in failing to put money aside for a no-deal Brexit. I asked him if he thought the Chancellor was undermining Britain in the ongoing negotiations.
That may not be his intention, but I fear that he is.
So what should Theresa May do?
Well, I think probably a reshuffle.
And where should he be reshuffled to?
That's for her to decide.
Right, but he shouldn't be Chancellor any longer because
you think
he's holding up. You think he's holding up these negotiations?
Yeah, I fear that he is unhelpful. Yeah, I fear that what he is doing, he may not intend it, but in practice, what he is doing is very close to sabotage.
Strong words there, Raphael Behr. Fairly close to sabotage. Is Philip Hammond's position tenable? We have heard just from the Prime Minister's official spokesman that Theresa May does have full confidence in her Chancellor, those damning words.
Well, let's put this just in a bit of context. There is a budget in less than a month. And so, I mean, there's a certain irony in what Lord Lawson said there, because if you think, what constitutes irresponsible behaviour or sabotage, a very senior figure in the Conservative Party, a former Chancellor, effectively asking for a serving Chancellor to be sacked a month before a very, very important budget might, in some circles, be considered kind of sort of saboteur behaviour from a different angle. Look, ultimately, the UK has to get on with the business of government. We're in the middle of Brexit negotiations. The fiscal situation is very tricky. There is no way Theresa May is going to remove the Chancellor 3 to 4 weeks before the budget. This is part of a broader negotiation that's going on between different factions beneath Theresa May and the Conservative Party, and a symptom of the fact that ultimately there is no strategic agreement across government on the direction for Brexit and the ultimate destination.
So, Claire Fox, do you think it was a bit irresponsible of Nigel Lawson to actually call for him to be reshuffled out of government?
Well, I don't want to start saying he shouldn't have said that, because that would be against my free speech ideas. But I suppose the thing that really struck me was he does speak to a nervousness about the Chancellor's seeming pessimism and not an enthusiastic endorsement of the possibilities of Brexit. You get that feeling all the time. So I can see that there are definite qualms. Sometimes it feels like he's indulging in a bit of project fear, which he calls forecasting. One wants to have a bit more confidence that the Chancellor is really gunning for a kind of positive outcome for the Brexit negotiations. He doesn't engender that confidence. So I can see the sniping will happen. I don't necessarily think that means we should sack the Chancellor, though, because I tend to agree that in terms of instability moments, that might not be the
thing
way
is,
forward.
Philip Hammond can only work with the forecast he's given by the OBR, and this idea that he should somehow conjure up a rosier, better outlook.
No,
it's a bit sort of like the idea of saying, well, we should just we should say that tractor production and output will be better, and then everyone would.
No, but it's also I can see your concern about we don't want to just put our head in the sand. However, I do think that there are ways of interpreting data and forecasts, and I have to say that there are ways of doing it that basically do come over as being antagonistic to a positive outcome. And that's what I'd say that has happened recently quite a few times. You didn't have to interpret it that way, and that's what I think the concern is.
I mean, it is clear that there is some nervousness amongst Brexiteers, that there may be a feeling of drift. I mean, is Philip Hammond just not being political enough? You can say he may be taking a realistic view, but Claire's point that you can still have a different tone. Do you think he isn't being political enough for the government?
I've heard this concern in particular that the way he's conducted himself is like this sort of grey spreadsheet Phil, they call him, the apparatchik. And at the moment, particularly since Theresa May was so weakened by the election result, there is a lot of raw, bare-knuckle politics going on in the Conservative Party, and he might not be playing that game terribly well, but ultimately his responsibility is as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And you know, the key point of difference between him and some of the harder Brexiteers is this one over whether or not the UK should be preparing for a no-deal scenario in the negotiations. And he quite rightly recognises that that's just an insane outcome to be targeting, and he has other responsibilities towards making sure the UK economy can actually go through this process in one piece.
But it was a legitimate criticism of what happened in relation to the EU referendum. It was the absolute refusal for anyone to imagine a scenario that wasn't going to be we're staying in the EU and to not plan accordingly. It is the Chancellor's responsibility to take into account the possibility of a no deal and to plan accordingly, not because he doesn't want a deal.
Right.
Because you need to know what you're doing.
Let's leave it there for the moment, because we will be returning to this subject, funnily enough.